Welcome to Recovery Rising with Kelly and Reva, a podcast dedicated to exploring eating disorder recovery through real stories, advocacy, and awareness.
I'm Kelly Doss.
And I'm Reva Van Vliet.
And in this podcast, we use our real life recovery experience to share our healing journeys and to share that with you. And we should note that we are not mental health professionals. If you are struggling with an eating disorder or if a loved one is, please reach out to a licensed mental health professional who specializes in eating disorders. So last week we got to give an introduction to ourselves, why we're doing this, the different types of eating disorders. And you'll hear us say this so many times. The recovery journey is not linear and it takes some time, but it's definitely worth it and worth celebrating. So this week we thought we would talk about, well, what does recovery mean to each one of us?
Yes.
We know that even in the medical community, there's no one consensus on the definition of eating disorder recovery. However, if you go to the National Eating Disorder Association website, they do talk about not only is recovery not officially defined, but that it can happen in stages. So the first stage that they talk about is the physical restoration of the body. So this could be being at a healthy weight, restoring any electrolyte imbalances. If you lose your menstrual cycle, getting that back. So restoring health to the physical body is the first stage. The second stage is behavioral recovery. So this means, interrupting and stopping the behaviors that are associated with an eating disorder. So that could include food intake restriction, or it might be binging or purging, or even overexercising. So stopping the behaviors. And then the third stage of recovery, the psychological recovery. So this includes the trauma behind the eating disorder, or it can be the co-occurring disorders. So anxiety, depression, just the emotional and mental parts of the eating disorder. So recovery in that aspect. And I have found that that is the longest piece of the recovery journey. And I should note too that even as you look at some cases, case studies and things like that of this is how we define recovery, that's even going to vary from case study to case study. So that's why you often see different recovery rates. So one might say 35% achieve recovery in their lifetime, while some might say as high as 60%. So there's those even variations in case studies as well. So we did want to take some time though to talk about what recovery means to each of us, and did it happen in stages just like we talked about, or how did it happen for us? So
and we again you're going to hear from us that it is just, it's going to be topsy-turvy, weavy, windy. It's not linear. And I think for each of us, it didn't feel linear at the time. Looking back, it doesn't look linear as well. And so for me, especially, struggling from adolescence into adulthood, my life looked different, at each point when I was struggling with the eating disorder. And then so my recovery kind of looked a little different. And I think what kept me stuck was that I really just wasn't addressing the whole of myself, the whole of my eating disorder and how it was showing up in my life. Was wanting to, be done with the behaviors, have a better life, better lifestyle, but not wanting to let go of some things that I felt like the eating disorder was doing for me, because it did serve a purpose at the time and at points in my life. Um, and so I think what really kept me stuck, looking back at my recovery journey, was not addressing um, just my whole person and kind of those buckets that you were talking about. Um, and I think now looking back at like my years of having been in recovery and feeling recovered, I think that I was just kind of at that point of accepting, and honestly just like die hard wanting to move forward into recovery and being healed, that medical and physical piece, and just really not wanting to engage in behaviors, and then working on those things that kept me stuck, like the voices in my head, and some of those thought patterns, and you just eating disorders are deep rooted and
Mhm.
co-occurring mental health illnesses and thoughts and patterns, and so addressing those was super integral for my recovery, and just and even today, just um keeping myself in a good spot is just really working on myself and
Mhm.
recognizing areas of growth, and yeah,
Mhm. Yeah.
so
I think I would describe for me my journey. That's often whenever I talk about my story is I talk about the stages that I went through. It was not only just stages, but also at certain points throughout the recovery journey, what recovery could possibly be
mhm.
actually evolved along the way as well.
Yes.
So I started out when I went to my residential treatment center. The purpose there was, as the first stage I talked about, healing the body physically, getting the weight to a safe place so that I could actually talk about the psychological reasons behind the eating disorder. Because, yes, talking about trauma does take a physical toll on the body, and talking about all the things that you're bearing, that does affect the physical body. So, your body does actually have to be at a safe weight in a safe space to address those things. So, that was stage one.
Yep.
And I think at that stage too, I was just like, well, if I can just get to the safe weight and get out of here,
Exactly. Yeah.
um,
Recovered
y-
stamp.
yes,
Stamp of approval.
I
Yep.
can go on my merry way.
Exactly.
And then, but the behaviors themselves were just
Mhm.
awful. They were so life disruptive, and they were just, physically, some of them were physically painful. I
Mhm.
mean, it was just chaos in life, and it really did take up a huge part of my day. It was the behavior part. So interrupting that, if I thought, well, if I can just stop the behaviors, life should go back to normal, or I should have some sort of sense of normalcy in my life. Because again, just how much it absorbed of my life and in my thoughts too, the behaviors. I just thought, well, if I can get past that, all should be good. Because I will admit there was a part of me that was really afraid to deal with the psychological reasons, the things that I was bearing and things that I would hope would just go away, the things that the eating disorder was coping with.
Mhm.
So I didn't want to, I wasn't ready for that yet. I was just like, well, if I can get rid of the behaviors, I can maybe have, somewhat semblance of a life.
Yep.
But it's still at that point too, the eating disorder voice that you referred to.
Mhm.
It was a point where it was just totally dominant. That's all
Yeah.
it felt like. And then of course, as you go on, it feels like more of a little bit of a war. There's the healthy part of you, and then there's
Oh,
the eating disorder part of
yes.
you. I was like, well, if I can just get to the point where, the voice is just not there anymore, if it was just completely separated from me. But again, the psychological piece is what takes up the longest part of the journey, recovery, and it can
Mhm.
feel like you're alone, like nobody else knows what this feels like,
No.
that tug of war that I was just talking about. But yes, I would say the psychological healing piece
Yes.
was definitely something that took a lot of work. But as the eating disorder voice got quieter and
Mhm.
quieter, and it actually didn't feel like it was the integral part of me anymore, it actually opened up like, this is what the kind of person I can be. And this can create a space for me to vision what my life can actually be like. So going from just surviving
Mhm.
to what I call the thriving mode. And I feel like, that's just something that's always going to be a continual
Yeah.
process.
Mhm.
Even though I do like to say I am recovered, I feel like the recovery process, or the things I learned in recovery, are really just a foundation of how I build my own self up, even though it's not eating disorder related about, behaviors or anything like that, about becoming the person that I want to. So I find so much gratitude for getting that recovery opportunity. It was a struggle, don't get me wrong, and there was a lot of fighting and, pushing back on things. But looking back, just what I've learned, the tools, the techniques, really have helped me throughout life. And
Mhm.
I'm just so grateful that I had the opportunity to go through the recovery process. I know not everybody does.
No.
And just what I've been able to learn. And like I said, maybe wouldn't even had the opportunity to be the person I am today if I
Exactly.
didn't have to take that deep dive and look at the things that I was pushing away and really too afraid to even look at. So For me, what I've learned, I feel like it always goes back to what did I learn from my eating disorder recovery journey
Mhm.
and how can I apply it to my life today? So,
Exactly. And I
yeah.
loved hearing you talk about the eating disorder voice kinda just slowly, dropping off, just and as that drops off, like you were mentioning, you are growing those pieces of yourself that, haven't been able to bloom,
Mhm.
before. And so you're really strengthening those pieces and parts of yourself that have really been suppressed because the eating disorder has been
Yes.
so loud, just so and it just becomes so like intertwined with everything
Mm.
you're doing and like I like and it sounds like that's the way you kind of talk about the eating disorder struggle is I like, talking about it separate from myself, just because it feels like it's you. Like, you're like, "Why can't I just stop, thinking like this or doing this?"
Mhm.
And then it kind of feeds into that cycle of, "I'm not enough, I'm not doing enough, my eating disorder recovery is not even great or perfect." And
Mhm.
so that was really helpful for me is to separate myself from that eating disorder voice and not like, "Oh, it's my eating disorder, it's not me," but
Mhm.
just making room for your voice to be a little louder in a different ways, and, like you said, just that self-exploration too that comes with eating disorder, recovery journey, and, um, I just you learn so much about yourself, and you learn, just new ways to cope and deal with the stress and unfortunate just like long lasting mental health illnesses that
Mhm.
we struggle with and they may be there and they may be something that you always need to work on, but you're more able to
Yeah.
because you don't have this eating disorder on your back.
Mhm.
And also, like, the eating disorder can be and the way that it kind of creeps in is, like, super sneaky
Oh
sometimes
gosh.
too.
Yeah.
And so I know, like, that was really a big part of my recovery journey was recognizing kind of those, not holes, but kind of yeah, I guess those holes in the work that I had done in the past, like, that I kinda needed to seal up, like, and, sometimes that means distancing myself from certain things like we were just talking about like you can't just stop your relationship with food, like it's
Right.
not like just that's always going to be a part of your life, and it can be a great part of your life. It is a great part of our lives. And and you know and even with like movement and all this stuff, but you can set boundaries around the way you want it to be talked about and the way that you even approach it. And
Mhm.
that unfortunately like sometimes can feel going against the grain in our society. But I think that is like just really important to kind of like assess like where can that eating disorder sneak in, and it might not feel like that at the time like that's what you're doing, but I
Mhm.
think by strengthening those other parts of you and doing that work in trauma work if needed, or addressing kind of those other cognitive behavioral pieces is just so important to make yourself, so sturdy. I always thought, like, I just wanna be really sturdy like a tree, nothing can blow me
Yeah.
down, and that's not possible because we always kind of life shifts and we shift with life, but, we can shift without the eating disorder being part of that, and yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Um, the separation piece. I know for me too, I didn't know what life would be like. It was actually kind of scary to think about life without an eating
Yeah.
disorder. So that was part of my healing journey too, was okay, so if this is, we'll just say removed from me, the
Mhm.
eating disorder, if it goes away, who am I going to be? How am I going to
Exactly.
deal with life? It just
Mm.
felt so raw in a way, to think about life without the eating disorder. So it was actually quite scary as much as I hated it,
Yeah.
and how awful it made life and, everyday living. It was also very scary for me to think about life without the eating disorder because one, it felt like it was a part of who I was
Yeah.
and my identity.
Mhm.
And also, too, like, how do I cope with the feelings that I don't want to feel?
Exactly.
So, yeah, so thinking about what life could be like without it was scary, but
Mhm.
also in a way, too, once I took the baby steps, it just became actually more maybe exciting to think about what my life could actually be and who's the person that I become. And it also, too, part of that, you said sneaky, and I think that's part of it as well, is maybe I wasn't hearing the eating disorder voice, belittle me or demeaning me about, things like weight and all that. But it would show up in different
Yeah.
ways. Probably more, people without an eating disorder might experience, such as my perfectionism
Yeah.
or that wasn't good enough. As you were saying, those messages I would hear um, in a non-eating disorder way. So catching those and
Mhm.
addressing those thought patterns as well was part of the eating disorder recovery. So even once, I was at a safe weight, I wasn't doing the eating disorder behaviors anymore. Some of the thought patterns were existing in what maybe seemed like a more innocuous way, but were actually still eating disorder patterns in a
Yeah.
way, but they just weren't about food or weight or anything like that. So they were kind of showing up and I had to catch those.
Yes.
And as we've addressed, it's usually a team of people
It
that
is.
helps you see
Yes.
these things.
Yes.
Or as you're talking, somebody might say, well, is that really the reality? And, it's just kind of having those sounding boards, like that team of support around you to help you
Yes.
through even those last stages of recovery. It's really vital too. So it's seeing the sneaky parts too
Yes.
as part of the recovery journey for me. So
Exactly,
yeah.
and it's been so helpful for me to have a team and, a clinical team, but also a support team.
Mhm,
So my husband, my family, and again, that looks different, and has looked different, like, throughout my recovery journey, but, um, just having that kind of outside voice other than myself to that reassurance that I'm making those choices that are in line with myself, my authentic Riva,
mhm,
and, also just kind of being there in the fight with me too. So, because it is really scary to, like,
mhm,
think about life without the eating disorder and what does that even look like? What does that mean? And, especially when it is, becomes such a part of you, like,
yeah,
it's been there throughout um, your life wins, your life struggles, and just kind of like, yeah, just like anything else, like thinking about life without the eating disorder can be really scary. But then now looking back at life without the eating disorder,
mhm,
it's like, wow, like, life has just opened up, and I heard people tell me that, like, even as a kid, people would be like, um, just and I wish there were more voices of recovery back then, we talked about that in our
mhm,
last episode, but just really, but people would say, like, "Just let there's a whole world out there," and I was like, "Yeah, but what does that even mean?" But when I look
mhm,
at my life, at the last several years, and even the other moments of recovery in my life, it just is like it just, like, flourishes. It's this
yeah,
and it doesn't mean it's, like, all happiness.
right.
I've had, immense moments and times of struggle
Mhm,
and challenge, but, what wasn't there was me slipping back into those eating disorder behaviors and then being able to grow from it and being able to
mm,
protect myself and stand up for myself instead of, like, going into those patterns of shame and
mm,
yeah, so I think that it is so important again to stress that recovery isn't linear, but I think what a great thing that it isn't linear because we wouldn't be able to have those moments of exploration or just like growing ourselves as a whole person with if it's just point A to, point B or
mhm,
like boop boop boop. It's just yeah. So although yeah, again, don't wish this on anyone. We want to hopefully just see that decrease in prevalence in our lifetime of eating disorders and change the narrative and stigma around eating disorders, but there's something to celebrate about our eating disorder recovery journey.
absolutely. So recovery will again be different for every
Yes.
person, and recovery is going to be defined differently
Mhm.
as you go through the journey. It's going to evolve.
Yes.
And I think one point of the recovered, how I can use that term
Mhm.
to describe the journey, is the eating disorder as a coping mechanism doesn't feel like an option
No.
anymore. I
No.
mean, there were certainly points where I was like, "Oh, is relapsing potentially going to happen?"
Mhm.
But I feel like it's just not a way to deal with the emotions or things going on in my life anymore. I know it was just a band-aid, like you said. It served a purpose at
Yeah,
a point in my
it
life.
did. Mhm.
But now it just doesn't feel like I would go back to that. So for me, that's part of the recovered definition is that's just not something I feel like I would go back
No,
to, um, yes, at this point in my life.
exactly.
So that maybe in and of itself is part of the celebration piece.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just looking back on that recovery piece and just yeah, celebrating those moments where you choose. I mean, you just it's not like, oh, I'm not choosing to engage in the eating disorder today, but looking back at those moments of struggle and being like, wow, like that's just eating disorder is just not on the table anymore.
Mhm.
And it's been so empowering for me to see myself as, and again, it's gonna look for different for everybody. Everyone defines it different ways, but for me, it's been really empowering just to say I'm recovered.
Mhm. Yes.
I'm recovered, and it didn't. Is again, it's not just that stamp of you're recovered. You're
Yeah.
done, but it's that continuous work and
Mhm.
that goes along with it. But just that um, I that is not just not something that I'm going to um, entertain or go back to.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. And for me, and this is part of the perfectionism, I feel like that was behind the eating disorder, which
Yes.
I'm happy to celebrate that is not nearly as pervasive as it used to be or as intense. Worked on the perfectionism. But for me, I'm a big picture person. So for me, it's always the big goal. That's what you
Yes.
celebrate.
Exactly.
I still struggle to, take the small wins along
Yeah.
the way. And that's something I wish I would have done more in recovery. Yeah, I feel like that's something I still need to work on to this day is celebrating the small wins, whether it's building up my confidence, like you said, setting a boundary and having my own voice, and standing up for myself. So yeah, it's what did the celebrating that look like? And I think it's also important too, because I believe you've probably heard this too on your recovery journey is you're courageous. And
Oh, yeah.
I always felt like, no, this was not an act of recovery. It would seem like it was a life or death really decision
Yes.
is what I was
Mhm.
making.
Yes.
But yeah, I think to face all the reasons behind the eating disorder, the things that you were trying to bury and, wish away or run away
Mhm.
from, that does take courage. Absolutely.
Does.
So accepting compliments, I think, is part of
Yes. That sounds like
being,
that's something that you
yes.
can celebrate.
Yes. So learning to even take compliments, I think that's a form of celebration too, is
Yeah.
when you can accept that because, it can be uncomfortable to accept compliments
Exactly.
for many people. So I think when you can get to that point too, that's part of building into the person you want to become. Yeah, is the gratitude and yes, learning what different ways of celebrating looks like. So
Exactly.
definitely engage in that part of the recovery
Yeah.
process.
Well, I think this is celebrating
Yes.
recovery, just having these conversations and just have spreading these conversations around the importance of um just bringing awareness and advocacy to the eating disorder world. And we want to be those positive voices of recovery, like we mentioned last week. And so these conversations are super worth celebrating for me.
Mhm.
And even like I mentioned, like just for me when I kind of catch myself like, oh wow, like a moment of where my old patterns would be falling into beating myself up, and then it would kinda just cycle from there, and kinda go into that shame and just that old cycle that I would fall into really easily and then end up, engaging in my eating disorder behaviors and getting caught. And now, like, having tough conversations or having a hard day or something's, stressful is happening, catching myself and being like, "Wow, I took care of myself today. I spoke up for myself." And, although you don't think about that as like, "Oh, I was celebrating a hard day," but that is, like, something worth celebrating, is having those moments and still getting through them. And, and I just for me too, another big piece is advocacy, speaking up against, like, things that I think our society normalizes, like diet culture and all that stuff. That's been really healing for me. That's, again, very personal, for each person, and then also just breaking some of those generational, cycles too, and, like, my family and that's kind of, like, deeper, but I
Mhm.
do think that is something worth celebrating,
Yeah.
and you often don't celebrate, that kind of that
Mhm.
hard stuff, but also, like, laying in bed a little later than usual with my
Yes.
family,
Yeah.
that's, definitely the kind of
Mm.
those little daily wins and, um, yeah,
Mhm.
so
Yeah, I think, and you can add to this too, I think some takeaways from this conversation is one, you'll hear us say this many times, recovery is not linear. Recovery takes time.
Mhm.
Recovery can happen in stages. And also, too, it's just what you learn along the way. And also, I think along with the recovery journey, what you learn about yourself. And
Yeah.
it's just, yeah, I feel like the person I am now, I don't know if I could have become that if I hadn't done the work. So, yeah, we've talked about different ways that we can celebrate our recovery, and just like we said, the recovery journey is long. It's work, but it's definitely worth it.
Absolutely worth
And
it.
it is absolutely possible.
Yes.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So, in the comment section, if you would like, you can share with us ways that you celebrate recovery. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining us today and see you next time. With honesty and compassion, Recovery Rising is here to remind you that recovery isn't just possible, it's worth celebrating. Join us next week for another episode of Recovery Rising with Kelly and Reba.